Alright, hello and welcome to my Oberon rework video. So, I've been trying to do this for a while, but I think I've finally been able to put together a set of changes that I think bring Oberon into a place where he can hold his own and his theme fits, and that he has a place in Warframe kind of at large and like in the meta. So, before we talk about any of the changes, let's go over what Oberon can do right now, because that's pretty important. So, Oberon's first ability, Smite, is actually pretty solid, and I'm using all these abilities at their base. This ability, whenever it doesn't kill on these enemies at base, because you're level 20 butchers, is a hard knockdown that turns into these other projectiles that give radiation to enemies. This one is solid. It doesn't have any real synergy with the rest of his kit, which is really unfortunate, but being able to apply a hard knockdown to an enemy and then have some other projectiles just inflict radiation a lot of places, while the damage is sort of mediocre at higher levels, and by sort of mediocre I mean pretty much meaningless, the ability to inflict radiation to large groups with your one ability and do hard knockdowns on important targets is really, really solid. His one is maybe the best thing about his kit at current time, so I'm not incentivized to really change that at all, am I? Beyond that, we've got his two. So, this ability is real bad. It gives you some status resistances, and it does a tiny amount of damage, but this ability is it just doesn't do anything for Oberon as it stands, really, and it costs too much energy for what's going on. The damage is low. The tiny armor bonus is mediocre at best, I would say, and it just doesn't really do anything for the pace of Warframe in general. It is minutely useful, and I think there are Warframes that do this much better at getting rid of statuses and, say, radiation sorties, but that is a niche use at best, and it's not really required at all given high player skill. So that ability is going to be changing pretty significantly. Ability number 3 is Renewal. So it's hard to show this off without a team, but basically what this ability does is it is a slow cast ability that sends out little orbs that attach to your teammates for a limited amount of time, that heals them over time and gives them a burst of healing at the beginning. The problems with this ability are that you have to cast it too much for what it does, and it doesn't stick to your allies. It's clunky and slow, and having to cast this in the middle of combat, it's just too long for what it does. So having that be just slightly more in with the flow of Warframe is nice. And of course, for his final ability, we'll spawn in some more dudes. Reckoning. So, Reckoning is a solid ability. I don't think it is a solid ability for the 4th slot, because it is on the weaker end of 4th abilities. Obviously, it can kill these like level 20 nothing enemies, but most things can. It lifts them, it blinds them when they land on the ground, it has them knocked down, it's got okay damage for low levels, but it is at roughly the power level of Radial Javelin, which is not very good. So, that ability, I think, is actually kind of fine, but in the wrong slot for Oberon. So, let's talk about some of these changes that I would want to make to Oberon. So, first of all, with Smite, as we already said, Smite is a fantastic ability. I don't want to change Smite at all. Hallowed Ground, on the other hand, just completely removed. Completely removed Hallowed Ground, because this ability is not enough to stand by itself. But the effects of Hallowed Ground are good enough to be rolled in to a more robust ability, which we'll talk about in a minute. Instead, Renewal would move up to his 2nd slot because it is good, but doesn't necessarily, it's not good enough that it has to be a 3rd slot, and I will change that a little bit as well. Basically, for Renewal, I would want it to be channeled, just hard channeled, no timer on, getting to your allies and then just sticking to them for a limited amount of time, because that's far too clunky. Once you stick it to your allies, it needs to just stick there and cost you energy over time for a heal. Because of that, the heal over time, I just took that, the raw base value. The heal over time, you take the 10 seconds of healing time with the health. That's 40 health a second. I figure, personally, that's a little bit too much. So the base heal per second would be 25, which I think is pretty fair, and the initial heal whenever it sticks to an ally would be 100, which I think is also pretty fair. So for this, the energy cost would remain the same, but as a kind of added restriction, because I am moving it to ability slot 2, I would want to set a maximum range that your orbs can target allies to 50 meters, which is the same as Trinity's Blessing, so the support abilities are kind of at parity with that 50-meter range. Moving on, Reckoning. Reckoning is in the 4th slot. Let's move that up to the 3rd slot, because it's at about the power level you would want for a 3rd ability, along with, like, Radial Javelin, let's say, although Reckoning has some more synergy with some other things that I'm going to be trying to do to Oberon. So for this, obviously, being a 3rd ability instead of a 4th ability, you lower the energy cost from 100 to 75, just because that makes sense. Because of that, I would want to take the base damage from 1250 down to 800, which I think is fairly reasonable. And to give this some more synergy with some other things I'd like to do, taking the blind duration up to 6 from 4, I think is also pretty fair for a more supportive 3rd ability. And I think lowering the damage a bit also helps with Oberon not being a part of any just like spam fest farming, which I think the devs probably want to avoid, which is why the damage is getting a reasonable lowering. Now here's the big thing. Here is the big like thing that kind of ties all this together. Removing the current Hallowed Ground ability gives you space for one new ability, a new 4th ability. So the new 4th ability I would want to add, I'm just going to call it Hallowed Shield. So this would be an Exalted Tower Shield, let's say. And it doesn't have to be that. That's just kind of what I would prefer. It could be an Exalted Sword and Shield, a Mace and a Shield. There's tons of different ways to go about it. But I think that giving him a shield, just in general, is really good and fits him thematically as a kind of Druid Paladin balance. Because he currently doesn't have a lot of the balance that is kind of touted around Oberon in terms of his defensive properties, and I think this can kind of fill that in. He's got the healing, he's got like decent offense, which this will kind of help with a little bit, but he's never really had like actual defensive properties, and I think this can bring that to him and his team as a kind of Paladin type role. So with that, whenever you use this Exalted Shield, I would want to lower your movement speed by 15%. Which might seem a little bit extreme, but because it's not lowering your like bullet jump speed and stuff like that, and it's just lowering like your moving around speed and like the speed at which you would be doing attacks with that shield, it'll give it a little bit more weight, and I think it'll overall just kind of make the ability feel better while also balancing it out a little bit in terms of its defensive capabilities, where if you need to catch up to someone, you might have to put it away. So the speed that this thing would slam into enemies at, let's say, something around the level of the heavy weapons like the Galatine Prime, like the Skindo, like those types of weapons where you're getting like kind of a slower, more methodical thing before speed enhancing mods and stuff, because this obviously being an exalted weapon would be taking the mods from your melee weapon. Base damage for this weapon, I kind of looked at Exalted Blade and the more like damage heavy focused kind of like assault stuff that Excal does in terms of his output, and wanted to balance it around being much less damage but more team supporty. So base damage for this would be 175, which I think is pretty reasonable, and to keep it useful against groups but also not make it kind of like Excal where you kind of want to stay a little bit away from enemies and shoot your waves, I would add a reverb effect to the shield. And basically with that, whenever you would slam into an enemy with your shield, the shield would have like a reverb effect off of that enemy that would be kind of like an explosion that would deal the damage you dealt to that enemy to all the enemies around them. So ideally, you would just want to be getting really close to enemies and just slamming them with your shield, just going to town and getting that reverb effect in a good area. Base range for that, I think, would probably be pretty safe, around maybe like a 5-meter wingspan on it outside of the shield. I think that could keep it aggressive, so like whenever you need to go in and damage an enemy, you actually have to get in there, you can't just sit back. And also the reverb effect helps in with that. Beyond that, adding some synergy with your 1 that's inflicting radiation, and of course you already have synergy from your 3, which inflicts a little bit of blind because you're using melee. You're going to be getting some benefits from that. You'd be getting like a 50% bonus damage perhaps on irradiated targets, which gives you a lot of incentive to use your 1 while you're doing other things, because it is a left-handed ability, which is really nice. And then ideas for like the charged combo would be that you would have a big movement ability, sort of like the Ekenbrunn has here, where you would, less flashy than that, of course, where you would do your hold combo and it would be a charge forward that would like kind of knock down a bunch of enemies with more of a crowd control focus rather than damage. And then beyond that, having a charge attack, which is hard to do with this weapon. A regular charge attack. This weapon goes right into its combo when you charge. The charge attack, like that, would be a slam that uses the hollowed ground as it is now, and also slam attacks would press down the hollowed ground at about maybe 10 seconds base. So you could still utilize hollowed ground and put it places and have like the same benefits you get from hollowed ground, but you have it wrapped into a more aggressive weapon, in that you could use like bullet slams like this to like set up and then fight enemies. I think it would be a lot better that way and a lot more aggressive, which I think could really benefit Oberon in general. Beyond that, having a blocking combo that is just a solid blocking combo as you're moving forward would be really good. Beyond that, speaking of blocking, having it always be blocking from the front, similar to how X-Scales works, at maybe a base blocking percentage of, let's say, 65% at base, and then have it go up to 90% whenever you use power strength mods, would make Oberon pretty tanky and pretty hard to take down. But beyond that, having like a 20-meter base range, where all of your teammates that are within that range gain 60% of what your blocking resistance is as damage resistance for themselves. So teammates are incentivized to stay around you. And then beyond that, the kind of final energy cost would be 5 energy per second. I think that could bring Oberon into a place where he's used as a kind of very defensive support for the more aggressive characters. In that, pairing him up with, say, like an Excalibur, a Chroma, Rhinos could give a lot of benefit to those types of characters, because we don't really have anything that fills that role, other than some buffs that exist on some of those characters, like Valkyr's Warcry and Rhino's Roar. Making something more focused on supporting those types of characters while also still being good themselves isn't really something that we have, and I think this could really fix that. But yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot that I would want to do to Oberon, and it's obviously a really complicated change that's hard to show because this is all I've got for a shield in the game, and we don't really have attacks like I'm describing for Hallowed Shield. But yeah, if you want to check out my notes, they're going to be in the description down below. They're pretty long, I would say. But yeah, let me know what you guys think, because I think Oberon could be a really solid defensive character and an alternative support from, say, Trinity with this. I'll see you guys tomorrow.